Oh God, those are my footprints, but I'm the only one out here. What you're about to hear actually happened. These are three true park horror stories that will change the way you see nature forever. And in that moment, Marcus checked his GPS and realized he'd been walking in a perfect circle for 9 hours at Mount Rainier. Then he heard his own voice calling to him from the trees. But what happened next changed everything. Because while Marcus was trapped in that impossible loop, Security Officer Terrence found dozens of child handprints on the inside of locked bathroom windows at Elysian Park. And then the rusted swings started moving by themselves as children's voices sang from the darkness, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Because the Brennan family woke at 3 a.m. to find their 6-year-old daughter speaking an ancient dead language to something massive lurking in the shadows at their campsite, something that wanted to keep her forever, and these families will never be the same. After story number 3, you might never go camping again. So let's start with the hiker who got trapped in an impossible loop at Mount Rainier, because what Marcus discovered in those woods defies all explanation. Story 1. The Loop. Marcus Chen was already shivering with a kind of cold that had nothing to do with the weather when he realized something was terribly wrong. His GPS said he'd been walking the Skyline Trail at Mount Rainier in a perfect circle for almost 9 hours. His watch was frozen at 2:47 p.m. His phone insisted it was 4:47. And the trail ahead of him was stamped with a neat line of boot prints that matched his own soles exactly, right down to the worn patch on his left heel. But those prints were coming toward him, not away. And that was the moment he heard it. His own voice from somewhere in the trees to his right, calmly calling, "Marcus, did you find the marker yet?" As if another version of him was out there, just out of sight, walking the same loop. But to understand how he got to that moment, you have to go back to that morning when everything made sense, when a 31-year-old software engineer from Seattle, proud of his backcountry experience and 8 successful runs of the Skyline Loop behind him, pulled into the Paradise parking lot just after sunrise, checked in with the ranger at 7:15 a.m., logged his route and expected return time, tested his brand-new GPS, glanced at a clear forecast and felt that familiar thrill of standing at the edge of a long, beautiful, completely normal day hike. The first couple of hours were uneventful. Well-maintained trail, occasional distant voices from other hikers, the crunch of gravel under his boots. But just past 9, the fog rolled in faster than it had any right to, swallowing visibility down to 30 feet and flattening the world into wet gray. When he passed a distinctive lightning-struck cedar with a twisted trunk a second time, he chalked it up to a branching path and his own distraction. When he passed it a third time and his GPS still showed him following the loop perfectly, a quiet, rational part of his brain began to whisper that something was off. Every time he stopped to listen, he heard a second pair of footsteps behind him, matching his pace exactly, halting when he halted. Every time he spun around, there was only fog and trees and the faint echo of his own breathing. He told himself it was refraction, acoustic weirdness in the mist, anything but the feeling that someone or something was walking just behind him, perfectly in sync. The first object that didn't fit the day came a little after 10, a blue hydration pack half buried beside the trail, the kind of older camelback design with a logo they'd stopped using years ago, its fabric stiff with age but not weather-rotted the way you'd expect in that climate. And when he checked the sewn-in tag out of habit, it showed a manufacturing date from 2006 and a barely legible name written in fading marker that he didn't recognize. It was the sort of thing rangers sometimes left as training props, he told himself, though he'd never actually seen them do that on Rainier. He left it where it lay. The higher he climbed, the stranger. The details became his phone signal flickering between no service and full bars, calls to his roommate going through but returning only a wash of static under which he could swear he heard someone counting softly over and over in a rhythm that matched his steps. His watch losing a few minutes at first, then 10, then nearly an hour compared to his phone. The sense that the tree line was subtly rearranging itself so that whenever he found a landmark to orient by, it would vanish the next time he glanced up. By the time he stumbled into an old wooden shelter near Glacier Vista, the kind of basic three-walled structure that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years, he was rattled enough to take a real break. Inside, under a film of dust, he found a weather-beaten logbook. Not the neat official trail register he expected, but a spiral notebook filled with entries going back to the early 2000s. Almost all from different hands, describing the same strange pattern: time slipping, trails looping back on themselves, hearing their own footsteps and voices in the fog. The last entry, dated in shaky pen from an October nearly 20 years earlier, trailed off mid-sentence after the writer mentioned 3 sunsets in a row and batteries that never seemed to die. Marcus photographed the pages with shaking hands, telling himself it had to be some kind of elaborate joke. But when he stepped back out of the shelter, the world felt wrong in a way he couldn't rationalize, like the forest was leaning in closer, listening. Hours later, according to his phone, though the sun hadn't moved as much as it should have, the loop finally broke him. His GPS track showed a near-perfect circle overlapping itself multiple times, yet he never saw the junctions the path claimed he'd crossed. The cedar tree appeared again exactly where it shouldn't. The air felt thicker, like walking through water, and then his own voice drifted out of the fog to his right, closer this time, asking the same question about the marker in the same casual tone he used on work calls. That was the moment he snapped. Instead of staying on the clearly marked, allegedly safe loop trail like every survival guide says you should, he stepped off it and ran. Straight down through the trees, branches slapping his face, mud sucking at his boots, his only thought to get away from that voice, from the sensation that the loop wanted to close over him for good. He barreled downhill for what felt like 20 minutes, lungs burning, and then, with absurd suddenness, the forest spit him out onto asphalt. Highway 706, where a startled family in a minivan nearly hit him before screeching to a stop. They bundled him into the car, talking over each other about the missing hiker search and rescue had been looking for since yesterday afternoon. Yesterday. At the ranger station, wrapped in a blanket and shaking, he learned that according to everyone else's clocks, he'd been gone for 31 hours, not the 10 or 11 he thought he'd been on the trail. His GPS log, when downloaded, showed an impossible spaghetti of overlapping loops that crossed without intersecting. The old shelter he described had, according to records, been dismantled years earlier. And when he developed the photos from his backup film camera weeks later, because habit had made him shoot analog alongside his phone, every frame from that day contained a tall, dark figure standing somewhere in the background, always at a different distance, always just on the edge of clarity. And in the very first image, the quick selfie he'd taken at his car before stepping onto the trail, that same figure stood directly behind him in the empty parking lot, close enough that, if it had been real, he should have felt its breath on his neck. Marcus moved to Colorado not long after and stopped hiking alone. But sometimes, late at night, his phone will glitch and flash the route name Skyline Loop with a perfect circle rendered on its dead GPS app, and from somewhere just outside his apartment window, he swears he can hear his own voice calling softly, asking if he's ready to come back and finally find the marker. Story 2. The Handprints. The first thing Security Officer Terrence Blake saw was the handprints, dozens of them, small, perfect, and pressed across the inside of the frosted bathroom windows at Elysian Park's Angel Point playground, glowing slightly in the beam of his shaking flashlight as the June night air turned cold enough for his breath to fog, even though the dash thermometer in his patrol cart had read 78 degrees just minutes earlier. He knew they were on the inside because he'd personally locked that building at exactly 6 p.m., walked stall by stall, flipped the lights off, and tested the door twice before turning the key. And now, at 8:47 p.m., every pane was crowded with tiny palms and fingers sliding slowly downward as if whatever had left them was still pressing there, still trying to get out. Behind him, the rusted swings began to creak and move on their own, picking up a sickening, unnatural rhythm in the windless air while children's voices drifted through the darkness singing, "Ring Around the Rosie," just off-key enough to make his stomach twist. And that was the moment Terrence realized he was alone in a locked park with something that had no business existing. 12 years of working parks for the city had taught him to shrug off weirdness. Teenagers hiding in the bushes, smoking weed, homeless campers, occasional coyotes. But this shift had felt wrong from the start. Wrong in a way that made him keep checking the rearview mirror of his patrol cart for no reason he could explain. It began with a girl who wasn't there, a little thing, maybe 7 or 8, standing by the seesaw in an old-fashioned faded yellow dress that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a family photo from the late 80s, lace collar and all. Her dark hair hanging in wet-looking strands even though the ground was bone dry. Terrence saw her clearly as he cruised past on his 7:45 sweep, slowed, raised a hand to wave and call out that the park would be closing soon. And then, in the 5 seconds it took him to complete the turn and pull up beside the seesaw, she was gone. No running footsteps, no creak of chains, no giggle trailing away into the trees, just an empty playground and a slight sway in one of the swings like someone had jumped off mid-swing and vanished. He climbed out calling, "Hey, kid, you can't be out here alone, where's your mom?" And got only his own voice bouncing back from the concrete bathroom block and the distant hum of traffic from Stadium Way. On the basketball court, he found chalk drawings that hadn't been there at the start of his shift, sun-faded hopscotch grids and 4 square boxes overlapping each other, scraped and worn as if they'd survived rain and shoes for years, which made no sense because the court had been resurfaced the previous summer and kept spotless by maintenance since. As the sun bled out over the skyline and the park emptied, Terrence's radio began picking up fragments of something that sounded like an old children's TV show theme, tinny warbling music he half recognized from his own childhood, before collapsing into a wash of static and whispers. And when he checked the dash thermometer again just before heading to Angel Point for final lockup, it was dropping fast. 74, 68, 61, then 57 degrees, as if he'd suddenly driven into a refrigerated bubble that settled right over the playground. The swings hung perfectly still when he parked and stepped out, his boots crunching on gravel that now sparkled with a rime of frost he could see in the beams of the tall park lights, even though it was mid-June in Los Angeles. He should have finished his sweep and gone home. Instead, unnerved, he ducked into the maintenance shed to grab an extra flashlight and maybe talk himself out of the creeping dread chewing at his nerves. That was where he found the box. It was shoved onto the top shelf at the back behind rusted paint cans and a cracked shop vac hose, a cardboard banker's box sagging at the corners with a strip of brittle masking tape across the lid. Someone had written on it in thick black marker, "Angel Point. Evidence do not open, 1987. Terrence stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over his radio, the air in the shed colder than outside, then peeled the tape anyway, telling himself it would just be old graffiti reports or photos from some long-forgotten vandalism case. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them. They showed the same playground he patrolled now, but with different equipment, brighter paint, softer edges, kids in high-waisted jeans and neon shirts all over the frames. At first he thought they were just blurred shots from a cheap camera, but then he realized that in every single picture the children's faces were wrong, smeared sideways, eyes stretched or doubled or erased, as if something had dragged their features across the emulsion while it was still wet. Under the photos lay a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Los Angeles Times dated August 16, 1987, 6 children missing after a flash flood swept through a then-exposed storm drain that ran beneath Angel Point. 4 confirmed dead, 2 never recovered. Beneath that, folded into quarters, was a single-page memo on Parks Department letterhead, the ink running in places where old water stains had eaten through the words. The signature at the bottom read Ranger J. Martinez, and in a tight, increasingly frantic script he'd written about hearing kids playing on the swings near dusk every year around the anniversary of the flood. About handprints that appeared on the bathroom windows and wouldn't wash off no matter how hard he scrubbed. About voices calling his name from the drain grates in the middle of the night, and a final line that made Terrence's skin crawl. Whatever you do, don't answer them. They're still looking for someone to pull down there with them. I'm requesting a transfer. That was when the singing started. It floated thinly through the walls of the shed at first, a high, reedy chorus of children's voices carried on the cold, too-still air. Ring around the rosy, ring around the rosy, over and over, the words slurring in and out of something else that didn't sound like English at all. Terrence stepped outside to a scene that made the rational part of his mind shut down in self-defense. The swings, all 6 of them, were in motion, rising and falling as if each carried an invisible rider, the chains groaning with strain. The air around the slide and jungle gym looked hazy, not with fog but with steam, as if some hidden heat source was meeting the unnaturally cold air. And every single window of the locked restroom was covered from inside with small, wet handprints, layered over each other, sliding slowly down as condensation beaded and ran. He knew, with the same certainty that he knew his own name, that no one had gone into that building since he'd locked it. He also knew, with a deeper, more primitive certainty, that whatever had left those prints wanted him to open the door. His training said call for backup first, but pride and something like anger at being toyed with pushed him forward. He keyed his radio, reporting a possible break-in and requesting another unit just in case. Then walked toward the bathroom, the singing getting louder and clearer with each step until he could hear the lyrics bend. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The last word voiced not like part of a childish rhyme, but like a memory of drowning. The metal handle was freezing to the touch when he gripped it. His key scraped into the lock louder than it should have. When he pulled the door open, all the sound cut off. No singing, no creaking swings, just his own ragged breathing and the buzzing ballast of the flickering fluorescent light overhead. At first glance, the interior looked entirely normal. 6 stalls, all doors closed, 2 sinks. Beige tile, faint smell of industrial cleaner. But when he stepped inside, the temperature hit him like a wall. The kind of damp, marrow-deep cold he remembered from visiting relatives back east in winter. And his exhale puffed white in the beam of his flashlight. "Park's closed," he called, his voice coming out thinner than he liked. "If anyone's in here, you need to come out now." Behind the far stall door, something giggled. It was a child's giggle, high and breathless, and it was joined by another and another, until the entire room seemed to quiver with unseen laughter. Water began to splash, though the floor under his boots stayed bone dry. Terrence felt his pulse hammer in his neck, counted silently to 3, then kicked open the nearest stall door with one hard shove. It slammed the divider, rebounded, and he staggered back at what he saw inside. Every surface covered in handprints. They overlapped and swarmed. Walls, ceiling, back of the door, even the metal toilet paper dispenser, all smeared in some translucent dew-like residue that glistened in his light. The bowl was filled to the brim with stagnant brown water and debris, leaves and dirt, and something pale that looked sickeningly like the ribbon of a child's hair bow. As he stared, transfixed, something slid along the floor under the partition from the next stall. A small, pale hand feeling blindly, fingers splayed, as if searching for purchase. Before he could move, it latched around his ankle with a grip that was impossibly strong and shockingly cold. The skin soft and spongy like it had been soaking for hours, if not years. Terrence screamed, genuinely screamed, kicked and wrenched his leg free, leaving behind burning finger marks that bloomed in bruised patterns almost instantly. All the stall doors rattled at once, slamming and shuddering as if a dozen children were throwing themselves against them from the other side, and a chorus of voices shrieked, "Don't leave us down here," in one long rising note that seemed to come from the walls and the pipes and the drains all at once. He bolted for the exit, nearly tearing the door off its hinges in his scramble to get outside, and slammed it shut behind him so hard the hinges screamed, his hands fumbling with the key as he turned it twice, 3 times. The singing started up again immediately on the other side, muffled now, but still there, still wrong, still insisting. By the time another unit rolled up, a rookie from another sector and an older ranger who'd spent most of his career in the hills, Terrence was sitting on the curb, his head in his hands, his ankle throbbing under his pant leg. They swept the building top to bottom. Inside, the stalls were all open, the toilets clean, the tiles dry. No handprints, no water, no cold. His body cam, when they played it back, showed nothing but static from the moment he opened the restroom door until he stumbled back out. The rookie looked skeptical. The older ranger didn't. He took one look at the hand-shaped bruises purpling around Terrence's ankle and swore under his breath, then said, "Martinez had those marks back in '87, right after the flood. He quit a week later." The incident report went into the binder with the others, classified as unexplained. Terrence put in for a transfer and got it, trading Elysian Park's hills and shadows for the flat, well-lit paths along Marina del Rey, where the worst thing he usually saw at night was a drunk tourist. Months later, on a humid August evening, he woke in his apartment to the sound of children singing faintly beneath his bedroom window. That same broken nursery rhyme tangled with the rush of unseen water, and when he pulled the blinds aside, the parking lot below was empty, the concrete dry, except for a single perfect child-sized handprint on the outside of the glass at eye level, already fading as if it had been left in steam that wasn't there. Story 3. Site 13. Sarah and David Brennan woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. in their tent at Site 13 with the kind of bolt-upright panic that doesn't come from a dream, and for a second they didn't know why, until Sarah reached out to check on their 6-year-old daughter and her hand slid over an empty sleeping bag that was still zipped all the way up, warm inside but with no little body in it. David's flashlight snapped on and cut a pale tunnel through the dark. And there she was. Emma. 40 feet away at the old wooden picnic table, sitting cross-legged on the bench with her back to them facing the tree line. Her small hands were moving slowly over the tabletop like she was tracing something only she could see, and she was talking in a low, steady stream of words that weren't English, weren't any language either of them recognized. Sharp consonants and long vowels in a rhythm too precise to be nonsense. As David started toward her, beam locked on her thin shoulders, the light caught on something deeper in the woods just beyond the circle of the campsite. A tall, unnaturally thin shape standing between the trees, darker than the darkness around it, as still as a carved figure. It felt like looking at the negative space of a person rather than a person itself. Like the forest had left an empty slot there and something had stepped into it. Whatever it was turned toward Emma, and even from a distance both parents could feel its attention, heavy and intent. Emma didn't flinch when David called her name. She just kept speaking in that impossible language, her voice calm and almost proud. But to understand how they ended up in that moment, you have to go back to the afternoon before, when Site 13 didn't seem like anything worse than an overgrown, slightly creepy, "We got stuck with the weird slot" campsite. They'd arrived at Wayne National Forest's Lost Creek campground on a bright June day, Emma chattering in the back seat about s'mores and stars, the car still smelling like fast food and sunscreen. At the ranger station, the man behind the counter, his plastic nameplate said Wickland, had studied their reservation printout a little too long when he saw Site 13, and asked, too casually, if they wanted to switch to Site 8 instead, which had just opened up and was a little closer to the bathrooms. David had laughed, said the number didn't bother them, they liked privacy. Wickland had hesitated, then said, "If your girl sleepwalks, make sure she can't undo the tent zipper at night," in a tone that made Sarah's stomach tighten, but before she could push, he was sliding their map across the counter and changing the subject. The drive out wound them deeper into the forest, asphalt giving way to gravel, then to a narrow loop road hemmed in by old oaks. Site 13 was tucked off the main turn, shielded on three sides by dense trees and undergrowth. It was beautiful in that heavy, watchful way old forests can be. A moss-soft ground, a stone ring fire pit that looked older than the metal ones they'd seen at other sites, and a thick, scarred picnic table bolted straight into the earth with rusted steel brackets. Emma loved it immediately, declared it the secret campsite, and ran off to explore while they wrestled with tent poles and tarps. That was when she found the rocks. "Mom, look, someone made a fairy circle," she called, and when Sarah followed, she found her daughter standing in front of a ring of stones maybe 20 feet into the trees behind the tent. Flat river stones and jagged chunks of something darker, all arranged in a perfect circle about 4 feet across. The longer Sarah looked, the less cute it seemed. The stones weren't random. Different types and colors fell into a repeating pattern all the way around, and there were 7 circles like it spaced evenly in a rough ring around the clearing, half swallowed by leaves but clearly not new. Probably some teen witchcraft thing, David had joked when she pointed them out later, but he'd avoided stepping inside any of them, walking a faint, respectful arc instead. As dusk slipped in under the branches, the temperature dropped harder than the forecast said it should. By the time they'd eaten and zipped Emma into her sleeping bag, their breath smoked white in the beam of the lantern, even though the weather app on Sarah's phone still claimed it was in the high 60s. They were halfway through their second mug of camp coffee when Sarah noticed Emma wasn't quite asleep. Her eyes were open in the dim tent, fixed on the nylon roof above her, and her lips were moving. Leaning in, Sarah heard the same rolling syllables she'd mistaken for a made-up song earlier, the same oddly formal cadence. When she touched Emma's shoulder, their daughter blinked and smiled blearily, saying she'd just been talking to herself, and seemed genuinely confused when Sarah asked what language she was using. They should have left then. Instead, they talked themselves down. Kids mimic sounds from TV. Brains get weird in the dark. They zipped the tent, stoked the fire to a comfortable glow, and eventually crawled into their own sleeping bags to the sound of the creek whispering somewhere beyond the trees. Sometime past midnight, David's phone, which he double-checked was on airplane mode, vibrated violently against the tent floor. The screen had woken itself up to play an audio file labeled with a string of numbers he didn't recognize. When he pressed stop, a male voice, low, droning, cut off mid-chant. That was all he caught before the file vanished from his recently played list like it had never existed. Sarah's phone did the same thing 10 minutes later. Neither of them mentioned it, both silently agreeing not to spook the other. When they finally dropped into a shallow, jittery sleep, they dreamed, not of getting lost or of animals, but of sitting exactly where Emma would be a few hours later, at that same picnic table, while something huge and unseen stood behind them, patiently teaching them to repeat lines of that strange language until their tongues ached. They woke gasping at 3:17, the dream punched instantly out of their heads by the shared animal certainty that something was wrong with their child. It all telescoped after that. The empty sleeping bag, the cold, bruised air outside the tent, the sight of Emma's small back silhouetted against the trees. Her hands sketching looping, interlocked patterns into the damp wood that, when David got close enough, he realized were carved there, faint from age. His daughter's fingers fitting into grooves made decades or centuries earlier. Her voice speaking in that endless stream like she'd been at it for hours without tiring. When she finally turned to look at them, responding not to their shouts but to some unheard cue, David's flashlight caught her face and froze him in place. Her eyes were almost all pupil, blown black from lid to lid like she was standing in total darkness instead of directly in the beam. She smiled, slow and wrong, and said in a sing-song voice that sounded like her and not like her at the same time, "You woke up too early. He's not finished with the lesson yet." Sarah didn't wait to negotiate. She grabbed Emma under the arms and lifted, and for a second it felt like pulling against invisible hands gripping their daughter from the other side of the bench. Her body went rigid, jaw clenched, and she shrieked in that other language, a word repeated 3-4 times like she was begging or arguing with someone over their heads. As soon as they crossed an invisible line between the table and the tent, whatever was fighting them seemed to let go. Emma went limp, then lashed out, not with fear but with fury, clawing toward the table and screaming in English now, "I have to finish. He showed me the words. I have to finish." The whole time, that tall shape in the tree line never moved, never rushed them, never stepped closer. It just watched, its presence like pressure on the inside of their skulls as they stuffed their flailing daughter into the back seat of the car and tore out of the campsite, leaving their tent and gear to flap behind them like abandoned skin. Emma stopped screaming exactly once during the drive, falling into a strange, heavy stillness, then spoke in her normal, small voice. "He's not mad. He says he can wait. He waited a long time before." When Sarah, white-knuckled on the wheel, asked who he was, Emma said, "The tall man from under the hill. The one who talks between the trees. He knew I'd hear him. Not all kids can." In the weeks after they fled, doctors and therapists wrote a lot of notes and used words like dissociation and stress response. But none of them had saw what the ranger showed the Brennans when they staggered back into the station at dawn that morning. An old, overfull binder he kept under the desk, labeled in thick black pen, Site 13 Incidents. Handwritten reports from other families stretching back decades, all circling the same theme. Kids between 5 and 8 waking at roughly 3 in the morning, sitting at the bolted-down picnic table tracing symbols they'd never learned, speaking in tongues that, in one case, a visiting anthropology professor had identified as closely resembling an ancient Ohio River Valley dialect not spoken for over 1,000 years. The Brennans moved Emma's bed away from her window at home after they caught her standing at the glass one night, hand pressed to the pane in the same place repeatedly, whispering to the dark backyard as if someone was out there beneath the maples. They put a baby monitor back in her room and started sleeping in alternating shifts. Twice that summer they woke to find her in the yard at 3:17 a.m. exactly, barefoot in her nightgown, placing river rocks from the landscaping into precise circles on the grass and murmuring those same low, chiming syllables that made David's skin crawl. When they called her name, she'd jerk and blink and insist she'd just had a bad dream, no idea how she'd gotten outside. Site 13, according to a quiet, unofficial notice the ranger later emailed them, has since been closed for renovations. But in satellite photos, the clearing is still there, and if you zoom in far enough, you can just make out the pale rectangle of a picnic table in the center of a ring of trees that have been there far longer than the Forest Service sign out front. Emma turned 7 last month. She doesn't talk about the tall man unless she's half asleep, when she'll sometimes murmur that he's almost ready and the door will open when the words are finished. On the wall over her bed, no matter how many times Sarah repaints it, Faint impressions of those looping symbols seemed to bleed back through the new coats like watermarks, returning in the exact same pattern every time, as if the house itself is starting to learn the language along with her.